Today it's time for a subject that can literally ruin my day when I have to teach it because it's so confusing, so irritating to explain, but also so totally necessary. The subject is about one chord, the major 7 chord. First of all, in the time of Bach and Mozart and Beethoven, this chord was extremely crunchy. At that time, they didn't even have crunchy peanut butter, much less crunchy chords. But they did have chords in their day that were considered stable chords to end a piece on, and there were only two, the major chord and the minor chord. That's why when we talk about the music that Bach and Mozart and Beethoven wrote about, it's actually easier to explain because they had more rigid rules, and unlike today, you couldn't just do anything you want without getting huge criticism from other musicians, from other teachers, and from critics. That doesn't mean that these old guys didn't delight in breaking rules or that they didn't explore outside the box, but there were places they simply couldn't go because the thinking of the time didn't allow it. When we describe theory in terms of what these older composers did, we often call it common practice, and most theory exams today are still based on those arcane rules and that fuzzy thinking. So common practice theory only works for music of that time or earlier, and only sometimes. Even for that time, it fails miserably in other instances, even though to some extent it makes sense in more limited ways. Today? Does it make sense today? Absolutely not, but let's get to more about that later. Now back to major and the problem. When we talk about major chords, we all agree on what they are and what they sound like. Most people can learn to hear the difference between a major and a minor chord. However, for major chords, the word is entirely linked to the quality of sound, to a particular chord, and the meaning is very clear. It never changes. But that same word, major, was used traditionally for a very long time to describe the size of intervals. And that leads right to the intervals that I call Escher intervals, which are so incredibly confusing and illogical. With students, I stay away from these names at all costs. There are 4 intervals that are traditionally described as major, and here are those Escher intervals. Major second, which is actually a tone. Major third, which is actually a bitone. Major 6, which is actually a triple fat tone. And major 7, which is just 1 half tone short of an octave. But now we come to the huge thorny pain in the butt problem. We need the name major 7 because it's a really important chord. And that chord is simply the chord we make when we start with a major chord and stick a bitone on the top, so that the distance between the bottom note or the root and the top note in the chord, which forms that major 7 interval in traditional theory, becomes the major 7 chord. And that major 7 chord today is a hugely important chord. The reason it's so important today is because now this major 7 chord is not a crunchy chord, but rather it's a perfectly acceptable smooth chord to end a piece on. That is a change in music that happened about 100 years ago or more with the composer Debussy, who started using the major 7 chord everywhere as an ending chord. Debussy is often called the father of modern jazz, so the similarity between the music of Debussy and the kinds of chords and harmonies we have in modern jazz makes all this music sound very similar. So now we have the whole matter, and you just have to live with it. A major 7 chord is a major chord with a bitone added on top. That interval in non-Escher terms is 1 short, meaning 1 half tone less than an octave. However, that major 7 interval is used universally in the major 7 chord, which is unfortunately named after this perhaps Escher interval, and we're stuck with it. So let's sum up with 3 points. Point number 1. In general, the major 7 interval is kind of an Escher interval name that I'm not happy with at all. I've tried to eliminate it, but I can't because of the major 7 chord. Point number 2. The major 7 chord is clearly a chord we need today and is WYSIWYG, or what you see is what you get. So using this Escher interval name gives us a very important and practical name for this hugely important chord. Point number 3. We have to remember two meanings for major. One is about a certain quality in a chord, but the other describes the size of several intervals and is a pain. Yet we have to use this term, major, to describe this super important chord which is central to our music today. And there you have it. Man, I wish I could make this simpler, but no one can. The whole terminology was screwed up several centuries ago and has ended up in our vocabulary today. Now we have this incredibly important chord that was crunchy in the time of Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven, but which is now just as smooth and easy on the ears as you can imagine in modern music, because today it's an important ending chord. Finally, I think we are at the end of this long story. I'm sorry I couldn't make it simpler or briefer, but this time it was impossible. The complexity and the awkwardness of the whole subject comes from tradition. Peer pressure from dead people. Okay, please remember to subscribe to my channel and leave comments about anything that you like, comments about anything that you don't understand, and comments about anything you would like to see in the future.